In the legal and moral landscape of ancient Rome, the regulation of female sexuality was not merely a private matter, but a central concern of public order and state stability. Historical records indicate that accusations of adultery carried consequences that extended far beyond personal relationships, reaching into the domains of law, family honor, and political control. The treatment of women accused of adultery reveals a society deeply invested in lineage, inheritance, and the preservation of patriarchal authority. Roman legal tradition, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, formalized attitudes that had long existed in customary practice. Surviving legal texts suggest that the concept of adulterium was specifically defined as illicit sexual relations involving a married woman. By contrast, male infidelity was treated with notable leniency, unless it involved another citizen's wife of equal social standing. This asymmetry reflects a broader legal framework in which women's bodies were closely tied to questions of legitimacy and property transmission. The introduction of the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis under Augustus marked a significant shift in how adultery was prosecuted. Legal codes of the period reveal that what had previously been handled within the household was increasingly brought under state jurisdiction. This transformation was not solely moral in nature. It aligned with broader Augustan reforms aimed at reinforcing traditional Roman values, encouraging marriage, and increasing legitimate births among the elite. Under this legal framework, a husband who discovered his wife in an adulterous act was granted specific rights, though these were carefully regulated. Contemporary accounts describe that while a husband could kill the adulterous partner under certain conditions, his authority over his wife was more restricted. Surviving documents suggest that immediate execution of the wife was not broadly permitted under imperial law, though earlier customs may have allowed greater latitude. Instead, the husband was required to initiate formal legal proceedings within a prescribed period, failing which he himself could face accusations of complicity. The role of the father, or paterfamilias, remained significant. Historical records indicate that a father retained the legal authority to kill his daughter and her partner if caught in the act within his own household. This right, rooted in earlier Roman traditions of paternal power, underscores the extent to which female sexuality was seen as a matter of family governance. The boundaries between private authority and public law were therefore complex, with overlapping jurisdictions that could lead to differing outcomes depending on circumstance. Punishments imposed upon women found guilty of adultery were severe and carried lasting social consequences. Exile was among the most common penalties. Chroniclers noted that convicted women were often banished to remote islands, a punishment that effectively severed them from their social networks and economic support systems. This form of exile was not merely geographical, but symbolic, marking the individual as permanently removed from respectable society. Confiscation of property frequently accompanied exile. Legal codes of the period reveal that a portion of the woman's dowry and personal assets could be seized by the state. This economic dimension of punishment reinforced the broader objective of deterrence, while also serving as a means of redistributing wealth within the elite classes. The loss of property further diminished the possibility of reintegration, ensuring that the consequences of conviction extended across the remainder of the individual's life. Social stigma functioned as an additional and enduring penalty. Surviving documents suggest that women convicted of adultery were barred from remarrying respectable citizens and were excluded from many aspects of civic and religious life. Their legal status was altered in ways that placed them closer to marginalized groups within Roman society. In some cases, restrictions were imposed on their dress and public behavior, reinforcing their altered identity through visible markers. The broader societal implications of these punishments are evident in contemporary writings. Roman authors frequently framed adultery as a threat not only to individual households, but to the moral fabric of the state. This perspective aligned with the political priorities of the imperial administration, which sought to promote stability through the regulation of private conduct. By codifying penalties and expanding state involvement, the Roman government asserted its authority over an area of life that had traditionally been governed by familial norms. At the same time, surviving evidence indicates that enforcement was uneven and often influenced by social status. Elite women, particularly those connected to powerful families, could sometimes mitigate the severity of punishment through negotiation or political influence. Conversely, women of lower status were more vulnerable to harsh enforcement and less able to navigate the legal system to their advantage. This disparity highlights the intersection of gender and class within Roman legal practice. The case of prominent individuals further illustrates these dynamics. Historical accounts of high-profile trials reveal that accusations of adultery could become entangled with political rivalries and public scandal. In such instances, legal proceedings served not only as mechanisms of justice, but also as arenas for the of power and the negotiation of status. The outcomes of these cases often reflected broader political considerations as much as the specifics of the alleged offense. The lived experience of women accused of adultery would have varied widely depending on their circumstances. For many, the process began with accusation and investigation, followed by formal charges brought before a court. Surviving legal procedures suggest that evidence could include witness testimony, written documentation, and in some cases, the testimony of enslaved individuals obtained under coercion. The reliance on such methods raises questions about the reliability of outcomes, though Roman legal culture placed significant emphasis on procedure and precedent. Once convicted, the transition into exile marked a profound rupture. Contemporary descriptions of exile locations indicate that these environments were often isolated and lacked the infrastructure necessary for a comfortable life. Women subjected to this punishment would have faced not only material hardship, but also the psychological impact of displacement and social exclusion. The permanence of their status meant that opportunities for rehabilitation were limited. The emphasis on female chastity within Roman society must also be understood in relation to broader demographic and political concerns. Augustus' legislative program, of which the adultery laws formed a part, aimed to address declining birth rates among the Roman elite. By enforcing strict controls over marriage and reproduction, the state sought to ensure the continuity of citizen families and the stability of the social order. In this context, the punishment of adultery functioned as both a deterrent and a symbolic reaffirmation of collective values. Chroniclers noted that these laws were not universally popular. Some contemporary observers expressed skepticism regarding the extent to which legislation could regulate private behavior. Others pointed to instances of selective enforcement or manipulation for political purposes. Nevertheless, the existence and persistence of these laws indicate that they played a significant role in shaping social norms and expectations. The mechanisms of control embedded within these legal structures extended beyond formal punishment. The threat of accusation itself could serve as a powerful tool of coercion within marriages and families. Women were aware that their reputations were subject to scrutiny and that allegations could have irreversible consequences. This awareness likely influenced behavior in ways that reinforced existing hierarchies and limited opportunities for autonomy. In examining the punishments faced by women accused of adultery in ancient Rome, it becomes evident that the issue cannot be understood solely in terms of individual morality. Rather, it reflects a complex system in which law, family, and state intersected to regulate behavior and maintain order. The consequences imposed upon convicted women were not only punitive, but also deeply symbolic, reinforcing a social structure in which control over female sexuality was integral to the functioning of the broader society. Surviving evidence continues to shape modern interpretations of these practices, offering insight into the priorities and anxieties of Roman civilization. The enduring presence of these themes in historical analysis underscores the extent to which questions of gender, power, and law were intertwined in the ancient world, leaving a legacy that remains subject to ongoing examination. The practical application of these laws reveals a system that relied not only on statutes, but on the active participation of families, informants, and magistrates. Surviving documents suggest that accusations of adultery were rarely neutral acts. They were often embedded within broader disputes over inheritance, status, or political rivalry. In this context, the legal framework established under Augustus provided both a mechanism for prosecution and an instrument that could be strategically employed. Historical records indicate that once an accusation was formally initiated, the process required adherence to specific procedural timelines. A husband was obligated to divorce his wife upon discovering adultery and to bring charges within a fixed period, commonly cited as 60 days. Failure to act within this window could expose him to prosecution for lenocinium or facilitating immorality, a charge that implied complicity. This requirement placed pressure on husbands to demonstrate public commitment to moral standards, reinforcing the idea that private tolerance of adultery threatened the integrity of Roman society. If the husband did not proceed with charges, the law permitted third parties to bring the case forward. Contemporary accounts describe how this provision expanded the reach of enforcement, effectively transforming adultery into a matter of public concern. It also introduced the possibility of opportunistic accusations, particularly in environments where personal rivalries intersected with legal incentives. Surviving texts suggest that informants could gain social or political advantage through successful prosecutions, further complicating the motivations behind such cases. The courtroom itself functioned as a space where legal argument, social reputation, and rhetorical skill converged. Roman judicial proceedings relied heavily on advocacy, and the outcome of a case could depend as much on the persuasiveness of the speakers as on the available evidence. Women accused of adultery were typically represented by male relatives or hired advocates, reflecting their limited formal role within the legal system. Chroniclers noted that the character of the accused, her family background, and her perceived adherence to traditional virtues were frequently invoked during trials, shaping the interpretation of facts. Evidence in adultery cases could be both direct and circumstantial. Witness testimony played a central role, though its reliability was often contested. In some instances, enslaved individuals were interrogated under torture to extract information. Legal codes of the period permitted such practices, based on the assumption that enslaved persons would not testify truthfully without coercion. This reliance on forced testimony introduces significant uncertainty into the evidentiary process, though it was considered a legitimate means of establishing truth within Roman jurisprudence. Conviction brought consequences that extended beyond the formal sentence. Exile, as a primary punishment, varied in severity depending on the location assigned. Islands such as those in the Tyrrhenian Sea are frequently mentioned in historical sources as destinations for banished individuals. These locations were deliberately chosen for their isolation, limiting communication and reducing the likelihood of return. Surviving descriptions suggest that conditions could range from austere to harsh, depending on the resources available and the individual's remaining wealth. The economic dimension of punishment continued to play a defining role after conviction. Confiscation of property was not merely punitive, but also served administrative and political purposes. By redistributing wealth, the state could reward loyalty or reinforce existing hierarchies. For the accused woman, however, the loss of financial independence compounded the difficulties of exile. Without access to her dowry or personal assets, her ability to secure basic necessities or maintain social connections was significantly diminished. Social exclusion was reinforced through legal restrictions that followed conviction. Women found guilty of adultery were often reclassified in ways that aligned them with socially marginalized groups. They could be prohibited from wearing certain garments associated with respectable matrons, such as the stola, and were instead expected to adopt attire that signaled their altered status. This visual distinction functioned as a continuous public marker of transgression, ensuring that the consequences of the offense remained visible within the community. The intersection of law and social identity is particularly evident in the limitations placed on remarriage. Surviving documents indicate that a convicted woman could not legally marry a freeborn Roman citizen of respectable standing. This restriction effectively excluded her from the social structures that defined legitimate family life. In a society where marriage was closely tied to economic security and social mobility, such limitations had long-term implications that extended beyond the individual to her broader kinship network. The role of the family in navigating these outcomes remained significant. In some cases, relatives could provide support during exile or attempt to mitigate the severity of punishment through appeals or influence. However, the stigma associated with adultery often discouraged overt assistance, particularly among elite families concerned with preserving their public reputation. Contemporary accounts suggest that distancing from the accused was a common response, reflecting the collective nature of honor and disgrace in Roman culture. High-profile cases illustrate how the enforcement of adultery laws could intersect with imperial politics. The exile of Julia the Elder is frequently cited in historical sources as an example of the application of these statutes at the highest levels of society. Accused of multiple adulterous relationships, she was banished under the authority of her father. Chroniclers noted that this action served both as a demonstration of the emperor's commitment to his own legislation and as a warning to others. At the same time, the case reveals the extent to which legal proceedings could be shaped by political considerations, as well as the limits of familial protection. The broader impact of such cases extended into public discourse. Roman writers often used examples of adultery trials to comment on moral decline or to critique the effectiveness of legislation. These narratives contributed to an ongoing debate about the role of law in regulating private behavior. While some authors emphasized the necessity of strict enforcement, others questioned whether legal measures could meaningfully alter social practices. The lived realities of women under this system were shaped not only by the threat of punishment, but also by the expectations imposed upon them from an early age. Education, socialization, and family discipline all reinforced the importance of chastity and obedience. Historical records suggest that deviations from these norms were closely monitored, particularly within elite households where the stakes of inheritance and political alliance were highest. This environment created conditions in which accusations of adultery could emerge from a range of circumstances, including genuine transgressions, misunderstandings, or deliberate manipulation. The legal framework also intersected with broader categories of sexual regulation. Prostitution, concubinage, and relationships with enslaved individuals were governed by distinct rules that further highlight the asymmetry of Roman sexual ethics. While certain forms of male sexual behavior were tolerated or even institutionalized, the expectations placed upon married women remained rigid. This disparity underscores the extent to which the control of female sexuality was central to the maintenance of social order. Over time, the enforcement of adultery laws appears to have fluctuated. Surviving evidence suggests periods of stricter application followed by phases in which the laws were less actively pursued. These variations may reflect changes in political priorities, administrative capacity, or social attitudes. Nevertheless, the underlying principles remained embedded within Roman legal and cultural frameworks, continuing to influence behavior and expectations. The cumulative effect of these mechanisms was to create a system in which accusation, trial, and punishment were deeply interconnected with broader structures of power. Women accused of adultery navigated a landscape in which legal outcomes were shaped by evidence, advocacy, and status, while the consequences extended into every aspect of their lives. The persistence of these practices within ancient Rome reflects a sustained effort to regulate behavior through a combination of legal authority and social pressure, revealing the complexities of a society in which private actions were inseparable from public concerns. The final outcomes of adultery convictions in ancient Rome demonstrate how punishment functioned not only as retribution, but as a structured process of social removal. Historical records indicate that exile, confiscation, and permanent legal stigma were designed to ensure that the accused woman could not easily reintegrate into the civic body. In practice, this meant that punishment extended far beyond the moment of sentencing, embedding itself into every subsequent aspect of identity and survival. Surviving documents suggest that exile was the most consistently applied penalty for women convicted under the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis introduced during the reign of Augustus. The destinations of exile were typically remote islands or isolated regions, chosen deliberately for their limited infrastructure and reduced connectivity to the mainland. Contemporary accounts describe how such locations functioned as spaces of controlled removal rather than rehabilitation. The objective was not reintegration but separation, ensuring that the convicted individual remained outside the networks of influence and kinship that defined Roman civic life. Within these conditions, survival depended heavily on residual wealth or external family support. Legal codes of the period reveal that although property confiscation was common, not all assets were always removed in full, leaving some exiled women with partial means of subsistence. However, access to these resources was often mediated by distance, administrative oversight, and the willingness of relatives to assist. Chroniclers noted that in many cases, social abandonment compounded the formal punishment, effectively isolating the individual beyond what the law itself prescribed. The psychological dimension of exile is more difficult to reconstruct, yet historical interpretation based on letters, legal petitions, and literary references suggests that the experience involved prolonged uncertainty and diminished social identity. Roman culture placed significant emphasis on household belonging and civic status, and removal from these structures resulted in a form of legal invisibility. The convicted woman remained alive within the legal system but functionally excluded from the rights and relationships that had previously defined her place in society. Legal restrictions following conviction reinforced this exclusion. Women found guilty of adultery were permanently barred from remarriage within respectable Roman society, a consequence that had cascading effects on inheritance rights, family alliances, and economic stability. Surviving legal texts indicate that even informal relationships could carry risks, as association with a convicted adulteress could damage the reputation of male partners and their families. This created a reinforcing cycle of isolation in which social contact itself became constrained by legal stigma. The role of public perception remained central throughout this process. Historical records indicate that reputation in Roman society operated as a form of social currency, closely tied to legal standing. Once compromised by an adultery conviction, a woman's reputation was difficult to restore, regardless of later conduct. The absence of formal mechanisms for rehabilitation meant that punishment was effectively irreversible, embedding the consequences into the structure of identity itself. In some cases, imperial intervention could alter outcomes, though such instances were exceptional and often politically motivated. The case of Julia the Elder remains one of the most frequently cited examples. Her exile, imposed under the authority of her father, illustrates how even members of the imperial family were subject to the legal framework they helped establish. Historical accounts suggest that her punishment was intended to reinforce the credibility of moral legislation, though it also generated considerable public controversy and speculation about the motivations behind the charges. Beyond elite cases, the majority of convicted women remain largely invisible in the historical record. Surviving documentation tends to focus on legal principles and high-profile trials rather than the experiences of ordinary individuals. Nevertheless, the structure of the law allows for certain conclusions about the likely outcomes faced by non-elite women. Without access to political influence or extensive wealth, their capacity to mitigate punishment would have been significantly limited, resulting in more direct and sustained forms of exclusion. The broader social implications of these practices reveal a legal system deeply intertwined with the regulation of family structure and inheritance. Historical analysis suggests that adultery laws were not solely concerned with moral behavior, but also with ensuring the clarity of lineage and the stability of property transmission. By enforcing strict penalties on women, the system sought to eliminate uncertainty regarding paternity and legitimate heirs, thereby reinforcing the economic foundations of elite continuity.